let's get things started. So I want to say thank you everyone for joining. My name is Cody Armstrong, and also on the line is Ethan. Ethan will be able to help with any questions that you have. I also have the questions dialogue up, and we'll be able to answer any questions that you have as we're going through this. So feel free to ask any questions. There's a questions dialogue, and you go to Webinar Control Panel. Feel free to type in anything, and we'll do our best to stop and address the questions as we're going through this. So as you can tell from the slide, the topic today is variables in Onshape. So we have a short webinar. We're really only going to focus on how to create variables, use them, and all kinds of neat examples, where they've been used. So variables in Onshape. Let's dig in. Quick question before we get started. Is there a limit to the number of variables that are related in a design? No. At least I'm not aware of any hard limit to the number of variables that you can relate in a design. All right, so let's get started now. Before we get into any Onshape itself, I do want to cover what is a variable, and I think that's the most common question. Now, as I mentioned before, the goal here is to kind of introduce you to them. What is a variable? How do I create it? And how do I use it? So we're going to introduce you to variables. I'm going to walk you through creating a few variables and then how to use them. And I have a few examples that I think are particularly relevant. Now, some of them are obvious, the ability to create equations based on variables. I'm going to show you how to do that today, but some not so obvious. You can use variables in patterns, for example. You can use variables as an array, for example. I'm going to show you some of these in just a bit. So rough agenda now, what is a variable? In short, you can think of a variable as a container that you can assign a value to. And you can call it whatever you want. You can assign it whatever value you want. And then you can reference that throughout your design. Now, think of common things that you might reference. Maybe I'm doing a design and I design a lot of ribs into my part. And I want all the rib thicknesses to be all the same. I could create a variable called rib thickness. And as I'm dimensioning my ribs in my sketch, I use the variable instead of entering a dimension. So really you can think of this as, one more layer on top of that, traditional design intent, where it really allows me to effectively show what I'm trying to accomplish and tie all these things together in a way that's intelligent. So we're really trying to add one more layer of design intent to our design and make it more robust. Right? Now, a variable, as I mentioned before, can be set to anything. You can create a variable with whatever name you want and enter in any value you want and reference it anywhere in your design in a part studio that you can use. You can enter a number. So, it's a really flexible thing, but there's a lot of examples I can show you where it works in ways you may not necessarily expect. So let me show you what I mean. There's lots of great examples that I have for you. The most common, and I think, for 90% of those that are listening here today, the reason you want to use variables is because you want to drive things with equations. And so I'm going to show you how to do that. If you want to set, this divided by this plus that, and you want to set these all equal to intelligent things in your design, variables are your way to accomplish that. But they can be used for a lot more, and I have a few examples of some of those odd scenarios in just a bit where they can really make a big difference in the design. All right, so let's jump into it now. A few tips before we get into Onshape. One of the first is variables in Onshape are order dependent. What I mean by that is they essentially show up as a feature in your feature list and therefore dependent on the order that the features are rebuilt in your feature list. And so it's an important thing to keep in mind when you're creating variables to make sure that the variable is above the sketch or feature that you're trying to tie it to. And I'll show you an example of this and why it's important in just a bit. But keep in mind, variables are order dependent. They show up in your feature list just like your sketches and features. Now you can reference a variable using the hash symbol. So if I create a variable called length, I reference it anywhere I'd like with hash symbol length, and whatever hash symbol variable name that you define. So important thing, you use the hash symbol to reference it when you're using it in your sketches or features. You can use a variable anywhere you can insert a number in a part studio. So it's not specific to sketches. You can, reference a variable for the depth of your extrude, for example, very easily. So it's not specific to sketches. You can use it just about anywhere that you can insert a number in a part studio. It is not yet supported at the assembly level. I'm going to go over that in just a bit, but that is one limitation as of today. You cannot insert or reference any variable at the assembly level. So these are just a few tips for working with variables. Let's jump right into Onshape and get started with creating them. Now, as I mentioned before, I want to start really basic and essentially show you how to create a variable and then reference it. Question: do you have any time estimate for support in assemblies? No, I do not have a specific time frame. I do know it's a high priority for us. There are a number of users for ask for that ability to reference variables in the assembly level, but just keep in mind I do not have a specific time frame as of yet. I do know it's high priority. That's just probably as close as I can get, so I apologize. Okay, so I mentioned before I want to start basic, and the goal here is just kind of introduce you to variables and an example where you might use them. So I think the most common example is equations. I want one value to change automatically when I change another, and you can do this. It's a very easy thing to do, and I have a real simple example, and then I'll walk you through how it was created. A question that's popped up: is a single variable accessible between part studios in any way? No, and that's a very good question. These are restricted to the part studios in which they're created. So just keep an eye out. Again, when you create a variable, it's rebuilt in that part and not represented anywhere else. Now we can talk about derived features that are linked to variables and all kinds of other workarounds, but it's important to keep in mind you can't directly access a variable from outside Part Studio. Can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? Please email me. I have my email address up at the end, and I will share a link with you to the PowerPoint if you're interested. All right, so as I mentioned before, the key to variables is that they're a feature in your feature list. And if I scroll down here, I have this simple pipe flange part, and it's a simple revolve profile with an outer diameter, an inner diameter, and a bolt circle. And ideally, this is a type of part that might change many different dimensions, but there are certain rules that apply when I'm constructing it. The bolt circle, for example, that these holes reside on should always be centered between the outside diameter and inside diameter. And so that's a simple rule that I can establish that says, this minus this divided by 2 plus this, and it will drive a dimension. So a very simple example, and I like to show this. Here I have two variables defined: flange OD and pipe size. And if I right click and edit one, I can click final here to see the end result, and I can change this. And the reason I like to bring this up is notice as I change the outside diameter that the bolt circle diameter also changes. So let's go back to 3, and you'll notice the bolt circle, these holes, the diameter that they sit on also changes. And that's because it's driven by an equation, right? So I have a simple variable called flange OD that drives the outside diameter. I have a simple variable called pipe size that drives the inside diameter, right? It makes it easy to change the inside diameter. And then I have a bolt circle that's constructed using an equation. And I'm going to walk you through this, so bear with me. But I just want to kind of set this up. As I go in, you'll notice this bolt circle's diameter is equal to flange OD minus pipe size divided by 2 plus pipe size, right? And that's what maintains that constant centered bolt circle no matter what I change the variables to. And forgive me if I'm getting a little over the top if you're just getting started. I just want to show you kind of what's possible, what you can do. Now, let's jump back to the beginning. How do I get started with this? So I'm going to jump to the next tab here, and here I have a similar pipe flange with no variables. And so if I wanted to change an outside diameter, I would need to edit a sketch and go in and change the dimensions myself. So how do we get started? How do we create a variable? And the first thing to know is, of course, where it's at on the toolbar. You'll see it on the far right. It looks like an X. You click that icon for variable, and you get the variable dialog here. Very simple. Give it a name and a value. Okay, so as I mentioned before, again, think of it as a container. You can call it whatever you'd like and put in whatever value you'd like for that name. So in my case, I can say, okay, this should be the flange OD. Okay? And its value should be 3. So I'm creating a variable, and I'm setting its value to 3. I hit the green check, and you'll see it's been added to the feature list. Now, here's a common mistake that's easy to make when you're first getting started. Remember I said before, this is order dependent. Make sure that this is higher than the feature that you want to reference. If I were to edit sketch 1 now and try and reference this variable, it would not recognize it. I would get an error, and that's because it didn't exist in that point in the feature tree. And I'm going to explain why this is important in just a bit. There's a lot of things you can do with this that really make it powerful, but I do want to point that out. For most users getting started, chances are you're just going to want to drag your variable to the top. If all you're trying to do is have this fixed set of variables that drives your part, just drag them to the top of the feature list, and you'll never have that issue of whether they existed at that point or not. So again, variables are order dependent. In general, I'd recommend dragging them to the top unless you have a reason not to, and I'll show you an example of that in a bit. Okay, so I've created this variable called flange OD. All right, let's do that one more time. This time we're going to call it pipe size, right? And I'm going to set this to 0.875. So I've created two variables. I drag them to the top of my feature list. Now I can reference them in any sketch or feature that I'd like. So let me show you how to accomplish this. So let's say, for instance, I want to drive this outside diameter by this variable. I right-click the sketch. I choose Edit, right? And the dimension that I want to replace is this outside diameter. Right, 3.25. I no longer want to drive the dimension with this value. I want to drive it with my variable. Double click, and instead of entering a number like this, 3.25, I can do hash symbol flange OD. Okay. That hash symbol is very important. So again, hash symbol, variable name. In my case, flange OD. I hit enter, and you'll see it now updates to 3. Now, one tip that I have is you won't know at a glance that this is driven by a variable. The way you would know it is double clicking, and then you'll see the actual variable name in the actual dialog. So that's a tip, and it doesn't matter whether it's in dimensions or in features. You double click or enter the value where you normally type in a number, and you should see the variable that it's linked to. Okay. Now I can do this again. In this case, I want to replace 0.875 by my pipe size variable. Right? So let's say hash symbol pipe size, enter, and now that's driven by a variable instead of a static number. Right? Now, why does this matter? If I hit the green check, initially the part looks exactly the same. But now I can change these two variables and alter the size of the part. So if I right click and edit flange OD, another tip if you're working with variables is the final button. That will give you the final end result, rebuilt. And you can change this. So let's change this to 4. Right? Notice the outside diameter that I linked to that is now 4. Okay. So very easy for me to go in and change simple things in my design by controlling it with variables. I see a few questions, so bear with me. Give me just a moment. In the future, will there be a symbol, something next to the value to indicate it as a variable? Yes, that's something we hope to improve, the ability to see dynamically in a sketch that it is linked to a variable. That's something that we realize is an issue, and we're hoping to improve very soon. Why not color code the dimension that's driven by a variable? That's another great idea. I would recommend, by the way, if you have an idea like this you're passionate about, use the feedback tool and let us know. This is a point where we're gathering a lot of feedback about how users would like to see this. We know that this needs to be addressed. It's just a matter of adding it, getting the feedback and adding it. So bear with us, but that's something we hope to add here soon. Is there an internal reference number for previously used dimensions? There is. It's not something the user would be aware of, or I mean, when I create a dimension, it is named in the background, so to speak, but it's not necessarily accessible from the user. I would say in those situations, if you need to reference a previously used dimension, variables would be what you would create in that situation. Is there a way to show all variable-driven dimensions at once? No, that's something that we hope to improve soon. Are variables case sensitive? Absolutely, yes. So make sure that you have the correct case when you're inserting your variables. Can you embed an Excel spreadsheet to drive variables? As of today, no. There's no way to link variables to an Excel spreadsheet. Something table-driven, so to speak, is something that we're focused on. I don't know that you'll see it necessarily linking to Excel, but something very similar in capabilities. So definitely keep an eye out. Can variables be namespace, perhaps one day after the folder of the organization? I'm not aware of a way to automate that. So forgive me, I don't think that you can automate that as of today. Maybe using something like feature script, but even then it's a bit of a maybe, so forgive me. Can a variable be a feature dimension from a sketch? Stay tuned. I have an example of that, so bear with me. Can this be done? Variable of a variable. I am going to show you a variable of arrays, and that's very similar to what you're referring to there. So give me a second. I will show you that. Are variables available in sketch mode? Yes. So, all right. So let's get back into my example here. Now, the reason I bring this up is I've, of course, now decided to drive my pipe flange via these variables, right? So if I change this internal value, you can see it changes to 0.75, change it back to 0.875, and you can see it dynamically update. So now I'm controlling the size of this via these two variables. But at this point, it's really no different than just changing the dimensions. Where you really get the power here is the ability to link things to each other. And I think this is what most users want to accomplish with variables. I want to set the bolt circle diameter, for example, equal to this divided by this plus this, or some example of that, where I want to set it to this dimension plus this dimension, maybe divided by another or times another. And you could do all of that by establishing first your variables and then going into the feature that you want to drive with them and entering an equation. Okay? And so this is the key bit. This is what makes, in this case, this bolt circle that I have defined here. I have a simple bolt circle, and the diameter I want to change as the outside diameter and inside diameter change. Right? So I can say, instead of driving it by this dimension, 2.125, for example, I can say hash symbol flange OD minus hash symbol pipe size. All right, close divided by 2 plus pipe size. Right? And if I get the syntax just right, forget my hash symbol, it will dynamically update. And so now, instead of this being a static number, 2.125, it's now linked to the outside diameter plus the outside diameter minus the inside diameter divided by 2 plus the outside diameter. And what that gives me is a perfectly centered circle between these two diameters. Now, again, you have to double click and you can see that equation, flange OD minus pipe size divided by 2 plus pipe size. Now, this is just one example. Really, you can think of any kind of equation and drive it in a very similar way. It doesn't matter if it's divided by or multiplied by or so on. Can variables contain text? No. I do not believe so. Is it possible to automatically round the calculated value of a variable up or down to match a standard drill bit size, for example? No, at least not with the variables that are out of the box. Now, I will show you a feature script feature in just a bit that was actually customized to create variables, and that's something you could pursue if you were willing to. But the standard variable does not have that round capability based on nominal drill sizes, for example. The thickness of the center part should be added to keep it centered. You can absolutely drive it that way. Now, keep in mind that this is a simple example I'm showing you, but remember, you can construct any number of variables and drive it any way that you see fit. So just keep in mind, that your possibilities are somewhat limitless here. You can drive it a number of different ways. Are there any plans to allow us to create and modify variables within the sketch? I don't know of any at this point, but definitely use the feedback tool and let us know if that's a critical thing for you. Can I get variables and dimensions by clicking on the variable name in the tree? No. No. Will I receive a copy of this webinar recording? Yes. Everyone that registered will get a link. So just keep in mind you will get a link to this webinar probably about 24 hours after we're done here. All right, so I've shown you creating variables. I've shown you a basic equation, right, where all I did was enter in the dimension where I normally type my actual dimension. I set an equation of, two variables to each other, right? So just keep in mind you do have the ability for simple equations, and I think that's what many users are trying to get out of variables. Now, I do have a cool example, I like to call it, of variables. I have a few of these, by the way. But this is just something to consider. With Onshape's multi-part modeling, you can model all the parts in a single part studio. So this is a single part studio with 40 parts in it, and it's a pneumatic cylinder. And the neat thing about it is it's controlled, the entire thing is controlled with two variables, bore and stroke. And essentially, this allows you to edit a variable, change the bore to whatever you'd like, and the entire cylinder will all update. All 40 parts will update. And so it makes it easy for me to go in and build a new size and have all these parts update correspondingly, right? So just a big tip. I'm not going to go through it necessarily. If I edit, this will probably take a while to rebuild. But just keep in mind, I'm using that one variable plus some, correct design intent at the part level to have everything automatically update. And I can change to a 4-inch, a 5-inch, a 6-inch, or any stroke length variation that I want by editing, one of two variables. Question. What about if tests, etc.? And this is something that you could do. I do want to show you. I don't necessarily know that I would call it an if test, but you can use arrays and variables, and it means that I can establish, if it's size 1, use these values. If it's size 2, use these values with that combination. I have an example of this in just a bit, so bear with me. But you have similar capabilities, and I have an example of it. I don't know that we have a specific if-then capability. Will you have the ability to create a function? Eventually, yes. That is something that we've discussed in the past. Cosine, sine, other mathematical functions I do not believe are implemented just yet. I think it's simple arithmetic at this point. Are your webinar recordings available anywhere if you're not registered? Check out our YouTube channel. We have a whole playlist of our webinars. From the pipe flange example, is there any benefit with working out the PDC in another variable, say PDC, and then setting the sketch reference to PDC, perhaps easier to see or edit? And that is correct. The question is, couldn't you just create another variable, I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me, that has the equation built into it so that you could see it easily in the feature list? And the answer is yes. And I could have easily done that and then just set that equal to that dimension. So a question, yes, you could just construct a variable that is this times that and have it show up in the feature list. It also makes it very easy to see. Will you be adding mathematical equations to variables in the near future? It's definitely a priority. So use the feedback tool if it's high priority for you. We'd like to know. It allows us to prioritize those kinds of things. Can you assign the mass properties for a specific part as a value of a variable? I do not believe so, no. Now, this may be possible, I should say, using feature script, something that was custom written, but we don't have an out-of-the-box capability to link variables dynamically to a center of mass, for example. Can we store the center of mass in a variable? We recently added this as a feature script call. It has not been built into a feature yet. All right, so back to my model here. You'll notice that I have the variable bore 4, and now the entire cylinder is a 4-inch configuration of that cylinder, right? And all the parts update, all 40 parts have changed to a 4-inch bore version of it. So it's just a unique example of variables where you can drive many things, potentially hundreds of parts, by a combination or a single set of variables. All right. Moving on. Now, is the ability to use a dimension to drive a variable coming in the future, i.e. the length of the dimension drives a variable with an equation on it. I'm going to show you an example of this in just a bit. It is available today as a feature script feature. I imagine it will be eventually added into the standard product, but you can add a feature I'm going to show you in just a second that will allow you to accomplish this. Is static dimensions or variables a more robust workflow when creating a component? I would say in many situations, I think that it is more robust, better reflects your design intent to have variables. And it's just a personal opinion. You may have others that argue, but it makes sense to define things with variables if they have relationships to each other for many different reasons. Can a dimension be used in an equation without first making it a variable? Yes, you can do simple math in the dimension dialog. You can do 3 divided by 2 plus 1, in the actual dialog. So, what is the scope of variables? Are they available to other part studios? No. Right now, variables are specific to the part studio they're created in. All right, so moving on. This is a simple example I like to show, but it kind of shows the capability of it. You have two variables that drive bore and stroke, and they control all 40 parts in this pneumatic cylinder. Now, by the way, if you're interested in it, this is a public model. It's called pneumatic cylinder. If you do a search for a pneumatic cylinder, you'll find a public model out there, and you can take a look at how this is constructed. Now, the next one is also a public model, and in particular, it's called the Pretty Patterns model. So if you're looking for this example, it's publicly available. You can take a look. It's called Pretty Patterns. But the neat thing I like to show with this is it uses variables in a way you might not necessarily expect that you could, and that is in patterns. So here I want to show just real quickly how this was constructed. This is a simple linear pattern. So one linear pattern drives all these instances, and they change by a certain distance in every instance. And I want to kind of show how this was constructed. So in this case, we have a simple variable offset, which is equal to 1. And then we set that variable equal to offset plus 3. And then we use this offset variable in the linear pattern. So in a feature pattern, you can pattern not just extrudes and fillets, but also things like variables. And what this allows me to do is say for every variable instance, you're going to add 3. And what that accomplishes is you'll notice every pattern instance is now 3 millimeters shorter than the last. So not only am I controlling the length of this, via that variable, but I'm doing it from within the linear pattern. And so there's an example where I'm patterning not just this extrude plus the fillets, but also the variable, which is adding 3 to the depth of that feature and offsetting at 3 for each instance. So this is one of those scenarios I think that many users wouldn't necessarily expect for it to work, but it does. You can use variables in your pattern instances. Now, one more important last step to how this is defined is in the extrude of the seat instance. If I edit this extrude, you'll notice there's a second in position and the depth is set to the offset. And so if the offset gets added 3, then this value goes up 3. And that is what creates that incrementing, 3 millimeter offset between each pattern instance. So it's just one of those scenarios where you wouldn't necessarily expect it to work, but it does, and you can pattern variables. Question: If I decided to export my Onshape part to Creo, will it affect the variables created in Onshape? No. If you export your Onshape model, it does not have an impact on Onshape itself. Can you go over how the variable was a part of the linear pattern? I think the key thing there is it's just incrementing it. So for every instance of the pattern, it adds 3. And because the extrude itself is set to that variable, when the variable changes, so does that amount of depth. Okay. So just another example of variables. This is another example why, I try to show that they are order dependent. I can set them after the fillet. You'll notice that I have several sketches here, and then I have the 2 variables, and then we have several more features after that. Just keep in mind, as long as the variables are above the places you're trying to reference them, you're okay. When you change the variable in the assembly, does it also alter the individual part studios? Keep in mind, you can't access variables through the assembly. Now, in the part studio, you absolutely can. and you can see from my example I was showing you before, you can model 40 parts in a single part studio. So you have that ability to change one variable and affect 40 or 50 parts. Now you can also use this combined with a derived feature, which allows you to reference separate part studios and have them all dynamically update. So that's a technique you could pursue if that's what your goal is. But keep in mind, no accessibility to variables in assemblies. Question. So you have two variables with the same name. Yes. We first established the variable as just being one, and then we established that it's the same variable, but the offset plus 3. The closest equivalent I can make to this would be if you're familiar with a programming language where you establish a variable and then you add to that variable. That's probably the closest equivalent, and that's what gives us the plus 3 that offsets each face down in the linear pattern. I would encourage you to, if you're more interested in these techniques, there's another one I have an example of in just a bit. Check out the Pretty Patterns public document. It is publicly available. You do a search, you'll find it, and you can even create a copy and take a close look at how it's constructed. This is another example of something very similar where I have variables defined for diameter, and I've set that diameter plus 30. So with every circular pattern instance counts, the diameter grows by plus 30. And we have slots here, and then slots plus 4, which means for every pattern instance, the number of slots grows by 4. And so you can see with this one circular pattern 2, I construct all these outside slots just by patterning the two variables plus the features from before. Okay, the sketch and extrude and so on. So just keep that in mind. You have the ability to use variables not just as equations in a simple sketch, but also things like patterns, for example. All right, so this is using variables in patterns, just one of the neat examples I always like to point out. But keep in mind, you can use variables any place you can insert a dimension in a part studio. So let's move on. Now, the next example I have for you is variables and arrays, and it allows you to build kind of these various sizes and map them to other values within your design. And the question came up earlier, do you have the ability to do something like an if-then, where I say, if it's this, then set to this. And this gives you a very similar workflow, a very similar capability. And so it's an important thing I want to point out. Here I have this, simple skid design or whatever you'd like to call it, and I'd like to build various sizes. And I know that if the width is this, then the height should be this, and the pattern instance count should be this, and the spacing should be that. So I know if it's this size, all these values should be set to a certain thing. This is a great example where a variable array can come in handy. So I want to take a step back here and start at the top, and that is variable sizes. And this is a simple variable that's set to 0. Right? The value's name is sizes, and it's set to 0. The important step is when you start to get in the other variables that are in your feature list. So if I look at this second variable called width, notice how it's constructed. Right? Open bracket 36, 48, 60, 72, close bracket, open bracket sizes. And so what this means is if it's 0, then this is 36. If it's 1, then the value resolves to 48. If it's 2, it resolves to 60. And so you get the idea. I have 4 potential combinations here, 0, 1, 2, and 3. And I can control the width based on whatever I've entered here. Okay. Now, to show you where this applies, I've done this in a few places. So the height is also an array of values, right? 24, 36, 48, 60, and it's linked to sizes, which means if I set this to 1, this should be set to 36. All right, so let's test this. Now, I mentioned before it's more than just height and width, it's pattern instance count. Right, so here's the number of instances in my linear pattern of these beams, and then here is the spacing between each beam. So as this thing gets bigger, I want the spacing between each instance to also get bigger. So let's test this. I go to Edit, I'll click Final, and right now it's set to 0, which were the first values in my array. But if I set this to 1, they become all the second values in my array. So now the width is 48, the height is 36, the pattern instance count is 7 instead of 6, and the spacing is 5 inches. Right? Do this again. Let's set it to 2, enter, and they go to the third value in the array. 60, 48, 8 instance count, 6 instances between them. So I do want to point this out, and I have 4 combinations. Let's go to the last one here. So there's the 4th combination, value 3, but it's pulling from the maximum from my array, right? 72, 60, 9, and 7. So I'm controlling it with an array that's tied to an original value, and it allows you to build sizes of known dimensions. If I know that this should be this, if this is this, I can build the arrays necessary and variables, and then just reference them for all the various sizes that I might need. Okay? Now, I know this is not true if-then logic, but it allows you to recreate something very similar, and it allows you to create relatively simple modifications. Literally changing one variable controls all the other variables, which then push down to the various sketches and features within my Part Studio. So just an example I'd like to point out, and that is variables and arrays, and it allows you to control a lot of variables with one. And so if you have one of those types of scenarios, definitely something very useful. Question. Can I use my variable in Onshape to help drive animation constraints in Autodesk Inventor? No. No, it would export as a neutral file format, and you would not have the variables. If the parts for 40 cylinder was used in assembly, will the assembly update even though the variables are in the Part Studio? Yes. Remember, the Part Studio drives the parts in the assembly. If the Part Studio changes, so does the assembly. Can you use formulas that integrate with ordered pairs, lists, and tables? No integration with lists or tables as of today, but something you, of course, could create an array of ordered pairs using 2 different variables. Can you use a formula that's based on the number of parts in an assembly? No, at least not using an out-of-the-box tool. I want to show you an example. We're getting near the end of what I wanted to talk about here today, of using a custom feature script feature. And so a lot of the questions that have come up, do you have the ability to link to something like a center of mass, for example? It's not in the standard Onshape toolbar yet, but it is possible through feature script. And I want to show an example that I think is particularly powerful that's available to anyone publicly. So just to check this out, if you haven't already, on our homepage under CAD, you'll find feature script. One of the examples I always like to point out, especially when we're talking about variables, is this example for measure distance. What it does is it allows you to select 2 things. It measures the distance between those 2 things and sets that equal to a variable. And so instead of the variable being this static number that you enter, it's actually a dynamically changing thing based on the location of 2 things that you click on. And this opens up a whole level of powerful capabilities that I want to point out. The other thing I want to point out is this is publicly available to you today. So if you have this need, you can click on use it. You can add it to your toolbar very easily. You'll see custom features. You can add it here, and you can use this feature. It is not in the standard toolbar, but it is one of the custom features that you'll find on our feature script page. There's a whole series of features, by the way, if you haven't checked this out, for custom features that anyone can use. But one of the ones that pertains to the lesson today is measure distance. And the reason I bring this up, and it's a commonly asked question, can I have, for instance, linear pattern instance counts dynamically update as my part gets larger? Or can I do something to that effect where, maybe I have a fixed spacing between patterns, but as this part gets longer, there should be more instances of the pattern being dynamically updated. Well, the key there would be, of course, the height. As the height changes, the number of instances should change as well. In this example, there's a custom feature, right? It's called measure distance, and it's set to the height. And if I edit this feature, it's called height, and all it's doing is it's measuring the distance between this face and this bottom face. And that value, in this case 4.63 inches, is what the variable is then set to. All right, so now I have a variable called height. It's set to this number, which is just a measurement. But now, more importantly, I can build more intelligence into it. So if I go into the rungs variable, you'll see that it's the height divided by the max spacing minus 1. So this variable is an equation driven by these 2 previous variables. What that gives me is the ability to dynamically change the height And because the length is changing and the number of pattern instances is driven by the length, as I make this taller, it will continue to add more and more instances to the pattern dynamically. Right? Because you can see the height value is now 8.3, and because that divided by the max spacing equals this, you have a dynamically updating part. Right? So this is definitely one of the more extreme examples, one of the cooler examples I could find of using a variable. And of course, it's a custom feature that ties it to the height, but anyone can add this to the toolbar today. In fact, real quickly here, if you've never added a custom feature to your toolbar, there's a big plus icon in the far right. If you click feature script samples, you'll find all kinds of very cool features. Fill patterns, curve patterns, point patterns, port features, tangent planes, all kinds of neat stuff. And you'll find measure distance in this list as well. Okay, so just keep in mind, you have a long list of features that you can choose from. Here's measure distance, by the way, and you can add them to your toolbar. Okay. And this feature allows you to set basically any measurement equal to a variable, which you can then use in other places. Right here, the rungs is equal to height divided by max spacing minus 1. Right. All right, so that really is what I had planned for you here today. I know there are a few questions, so I'm going to stick around, so bear with me. But I real quickly just want to jump back to my slides. I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining. If you have any feedback, definitely let us know. There's a question mark in the far right here, and you have the option for feedback. Give us any feedback that you have. It allows us to prioritize things. It allows us to troubleshoot. So definitely use the feedback tool if you have any feedback from the webinar here today, or you use it on Onshape in general. All right, everyone. I want to say thank you again for coming. And again, I know there's some questions there. I'm going to stick around and answer any questions that you have. But that's it, everyone. Thank you, and have a good day.